In May of 1997, an 11-year-old by the name of Quin-Rong Wu was on her way to school with her mother, not too far from their apartment on Manhattan's Lower East Side. Her mom left her close by and let her walk the rest of the way by herself. Now, nobody knows exactly what happened, but somehow, the little girl would find herself traveling underground in New York City's vast and often dangerous subway system, and she was in the clutches of an absolute stranger. Just about 2 weeks later, her body was found floating in the East River with various signs of trauma. Till this day, many still ask the question, who did this to Quin-Rong? And just as important, will this case be reinvestigated so that this family gets justice? New York City has the biggest subway system in the world, with 472 stations across the 5 boroughs. Many horrific events have taken place underground, and a lot of those stories have never been told. Today, we take a much closer look at the city's dark underworld. This is Evil Intentions Subway Stories.
Platform and the train.
Quin-Rong's story begins in the Guangdong province in China, where she was born. She came into this world on January 30th of 1986. She was born to her father, a man who worked as a hospital accountant, and her mother, a farmer. She had 2 siblings, an older sister and a younger brother. Since the very day she was born, Quin-Rong's childhood in China wasn't an easy one because she wasn't raised by her parents. She was living with other relatives further away, about a half-hour bike ride away to be more specific. The reason for this was that China had a very strict one-child policy. Since she already had an older sister, the family feared being harassed, fined, or even worse, having their children taken away, and in some cases, trafficked. So they sent Quin-Rong to live with a cousin, so they wouldn't have to give her up. This one-child policy was set and expected to be followed starting in 1980. Eventually, it was changed, and it was stated that families would be allowed to have a second child if their first child was a girl. By the time she was born, she already had an older sister, and while she was staying with family, they had Quin-Rong's younger brother. A difficult arrangement, but the family did their best to make it work. While her parents and siblings lived in Guangdong province, they worked as hard as they could, saving every single dollar, with hopes of moving to the States for a better life and more opportunities, and they would set their sights on none other than the Big Apple. After more than a decade of trying, they made their move in late 1995. The family was excited to be in New York. The liveliness of the city, the fast-paced nature of it all, it can be quite overwhelming for those coming here for the first time. But the family tried their best to adjust, settling downtown in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Upon arriving to New York City, Quin-Rong and her family would reside right behind me at 199 Henry Street. And when they got here, some of those hard times still followed. Living at this location as a family would also be the very first time that Quin-Rong actually lived with her parents and siblings, so this was a reunion of sorts. It was a change they'd been hoping for a very long time. But making the transition from China to New York City wasn't easy. It was a drastic change. Quin-Rong's father, who previously held a job at a hospital, found work at a noodle factory on Canal Street, just 10 minutes away. Her mother, formerly a farmer, found a job as a seamstress at NBC Industries, a garment factory not far from their apartment. The goal was to keep working hard to raise money and continue to build, but it was much harder than they imagined. The family worked almost around the clock, but they could barely afford a cramped 1-bedroom where they shared beds to fit their family of 5. Their rent was about $700 a month, while her father only made about $290 a week. The money that her mother would make depended on what the work week was like. If things were going well, she would earn about $100 a week. Her mother and father shared a bed with her younger brother, while Quin-Rong shared a bed with her older sister. The space was so small that the top of their bunk bed wasn't used for sleeping, but instead used as storage space. The building they lived in had graffiti all over the front, and clothing hung from the fire escapes and windows. If you were to see the building today, it almost feels like a location trapped in time, like not much has changed. The area now is surrounded by restaurants, high-end shops a few blocks away, and considered one of the most expensive areas in the city. A one-bedroom at this location today will run you upwards of about $2,200 a month. Quin-Rong was described as a shy, loving, and playful child who loved going to school. Although she struggled to learn English, her time at PS2, just a few blocks from her home, was a time she enjoyed. She loved arriving to school an hour early to get the breakfast that the school offered. She loved muffins and pancakes, and she couldn't get enough of them. She even preferred it over the food that her mom would make. This was a part of her daily routine. She loved playing the Game Boy her family had, sharing it with her little brother. Quin-Rong was allowed to play at Captain Jacob Joseph Playground, a park just a block and a half away. While there, she would sometimes play handball and also loved playing hide and seek with the friends that she made. This park was close enough to home that her parents didn't have an issue with it, and there were never any problems. She always came back home after, as did many other kids in the area. During her time at PS2, Quin-Rong struggled quite a bit with school, not because she wasn't intelligent, but because the language barrier made for a very rough adjustment in the classroom. Classes in the US were also very different from back home in China. She mainly spoke Toisan, the language she grew up on, and only knew a few words in English since her and her family were still so new here. Her grades suffered since she didn't do her homework for reasons mentioned. Quin-Rong's parents were informed of the issues she was having and had plans to meet with her teachers to see if they could help her overcome her struggles. Also important to note that these are common issues for people when they move to a new place, something children and adults experience within their first year or two of adjusting. Despite the rough transition and language barrier, Quin-Rong loved being here. She would often keep an electronic English-Chinese dictionary in her room, right at her bedside, because she was actively trying to learn English. She wanted to be able to communicate with her friends at school and wanted to improve her grades. It wasn't easy, but she was determined. Quin-Rong was also a fan of dolls and teddy bears, because back home in China, this wasn't something that was readily available for her and her siblings. Back home, they actually made their own toys. But one thing she loved the most was going on class trips. These trips would take her all around the city, to places like the Museum of Natural History, Rockefeller Center, and Coney Island, just to name a few. Each time they went on a trip, they would go by train, and this is how Quin-Rong grew to love the subway, taking the train so often in the short time she was here that she knew how to make her way around a little bit. Her parents and siblings weren't as fond of the subway since it could be quite confusing and often dangerous. It was clear that Quin-Rong was on her way to learning everything she could to adjust to life in the big city. But sadly, on May 13th of 1997, it would all come to an abrupt and terrifying end. Right now I'm on the corner of Henry Street and Rutgers Street, about 2 blocks away from where Quin-Rong and her family lived. On that morning, her and her mother would take the short walk, and her mother left her right around here so that she could walk the rest of the way to school. But whatever happened between this corner and her school right down this block, it remains a mystery till this very day. On that morning, Quin-Rong got up for school like she normally did. She brushed her teeth and got dressed, donning a green sweatshirt and a pair of jeans. She put on her red pair of sneakers and gathered her school books and the rest of her belongings. She walked into her kitchen where the rest of her family was, and she would say good morning to her father and everyone else. Her father had just arrived from his grueling overnight shift at the noodle factory, not too far. Once she was ready to go, her and her mother made their way down the staircase and out of the building, making a right to walk 3 blocks toward PS2, a walk that normally took under 5 minutes. What you see on your screen right now would have been the same exact route that she took to go to school. Her mother walked her to the corner of Henry Street and Rutgers, just up the block from the school. As mentioned earlier, she believed Quin-Rong was perfectly safe and let her walk the rest of the way by herself, something that they had done in the past. The block was normally filled with children walking, some with their parents and some by themselves who didn't live far, just like Quin-Rong. Her mother left her on the corner and waved goodbye, turning around to head back home and make breakfast for her son. But her daughter would never make it to the school. The staff at PS2 would let the Wus know that Quin-Rong never made it to class. Immediately, they knew something was wrong. Where could she be, and why? The closest she had ever come to giving her parents a scare was a year before this, when her and her sister went for a walk without their parents knowing. They took longer than usual to make it back home, but that was nothing like this. She would never skip school. She wasn't seen by any friends, any staff at the school, any other parents, no crossing guards, nobody. So where was she? Her sister and parents would begin to frantically search the streets of the Lower East Side, but every search would turn up with nothing. Every minute that went by felt longer than the last. Her sister would alert authorities at the 7th Precinct to let them know that Quin-Rong was missing, and they had no idea where she might be. Units were soon sent out, and a bigger search was now underway. As her loved ones continued to walk the streets looking for her, they would pass some of the Buddhist temples in Chinatown, making sure they always stopped to pray, hoping for their daughter's safe return. Then, they'd keep on searching. But hope was beginning to fade, and understandably, the family's worst fears were beginning to creep into their heads. Quin-Rong's parents would end up quitting their jobs entirely so they could have all the time they needed to keep searching and to speak to detectives from their apartment. They spent every moment they could listening to Chinese FM radio stations that provided updates and who were closely following their daughter's case. They were hoping for any positive news that would never come. In the following mornings, Quin-Rong's mother also took their son to PS2, where he also attended. But this time, she made sure to walk him all the way to his classroom, no longer feeling that sense of safety she once knew well. By this point, Quin-Rong, who'd last been seen on May 13th of 1997, had been missing for 2 weeks, with no sign of her. They waited for updates, a phone call, any type of news. But on the morning of May 29th of 1997, at around 11 a.m., they received a devastating piece of info in regards to their daughter's disappearance. The evening before, on May 28th of 1997, authorities would discover the body of a young girl found floating in the East River near the Manhattan Bridge. It was impossible to know who she was since her body was so badly decomposed. It looked like this body had been in the water for a few days. Not far from where the body was found, they would also find a red sneaker, matching what Quin-Rong was wearing the morning she was last seen. The authorities made their way to 199 Henry Street, and the grim news was delivered to her family. When they heard of this new discovery, Quin-Rong's father would tell reporters that he now knew their prayers hadn't been answered. He knew in his heart that this was his little girl. The mayor's office and the Fujian American Association each offered a reward of $10,000 for any information regarding Quin-Rong's disappearance. When her parents learned of this awful update, it was as if a part of them died with her, even if it wasn't confirmed yet. They were shown pictures of the body authorities discovered, but it was far too much to handle. They refused to believe that this was really happening. Quin-Rong's mother cried every day that her daughter was gone, but now the grief was much stronger, almost paralyzing. Her cries could be heard throughout the building. She sat on Quin-Rong's bed, holding onto a blanket that belonged to her daughter, still hoping that possibly this wasn't her. Maybe this was someone else, remaining hopeful that their beloved Quin-Rong was still alive. Police would carefully search through her notebooks at home to see if maybe there were any signs that she was speaking to someone, but there were no clues, just her neat handwriting and different school-related notes. When the body was discovered, there were certain materials found in her clothing that indicated she might have been thrown into the sewer system and floated to the river from there. But when they did a search on the sewer conduits throughout that area, there were no signs, no shreds of clothing, and nothing belonging to Quin-Rong. But very soon after, the medical examiner would identify the body through dental records, confirming the family's worst fears. This was for sure the body of Quin-Rong, and she had been savagely strangled and tossed into the river. At first, authorities wouldn't confirm if there were other signs of trauma, but shortly after, it was stated that her body bore signs of other types of abuse, with bruises on her private areas, although it was unclear when she might have gotten them. Police believe that her body might have been in the water since the very day she went missing, and it went undetected, close to the shoreline, until the awful discovery was made. Once the confirmation was in, her mother would cry out the following to reporters: "Every time I close my eyes, her face is in front of me. There's nothing to look forward to now." It was a horrible feeling that had set in, and nobody knew how to take that feeling away. Her family couldn't sleep, they couldn't eat. They had become shells of themselves as they tried their best to fight through the grief. The staff and students at PS2 echoed those same sentiments. Everyone had heard of the body found in the water, and of course, everyone knew she had been missing for 2 weeks. But when the reality set in that this was her, it was extremely hard to understand and accept. Now, the staff at PS2 were preparing to let almost 900 other students know that Quin-Rong Wu had her life taken, and she was certainly the girl found in the water days ago. Friends she made couldn't believe it. This could have been any one of them. Grief counselors and teams were sent to the school immediately. The students were given flyers that warned them of the dangers of talking to strangers and to keep to themselves. They were also advised to walk in groups if their parents weren't available to pick them up or drop them off. The fear of something terrible happening had taken over everyone's minds, and for good reason. Parents lined up outside waiting for their children once they learned of what happened, many of them holding their children's hands as tight as they can, wanting to keep them safe. Nobody had any idea how this happened, leaving a cloud of fear hovering over the entire area. Police Commissioner Howard Safir would let New Yorkers know that they had every intention of pursuing this case until they knew who did this to Quin-Rong. Police, however, had very little information to go on, but they did have something. A call was made to 911 after reports circulated. There was an eyewitness who stated she saw a young girl fitting Quin-Rong's description, even down to what she was wearing, but it wasn't near the school. It was at the Grand Street train station, minutes away. Quin-Rong had somehow found herself navigating the underground subway system, and she wasn't alone. She was with a grown man. He was described as a large white male, possibly between the ages of 40 and 50 years old, who had short hair and a beard. The young girl fitting her description was said to be distraught, crying as the man held her hand. This would have been only an hour after she was left near her school by her mother. The witness stated she saw who she believed was Quin-Rong and this man board a B train that she was also on, and this was around 9:20 a.m. at the Grand Street station. They got off at the West 4th station, 2 stops away. That same day, at around 3:30 p.m., the same witness saw the same man and the same little girl once again on the train, this time headed into Brooklyn. The witness remembered her from hours ago and offered the little girl her seat, but she had no reaction. She didn't accept or decline, maybe due to the fact that she couldn't understand what this person was saying. The girl wasn't crying this time, but seemed confused, like she didn't know where she was or why. The man who stood right beside her didn't say a word and didn't even look at the witness. He made no eye contact. The witness then got off at the Lafayette station, and the man and girl stood on the train. She wouldn't see them again. She called authorities when she saw the news about Quin-Rong missing, fearing that she might have been the last one to see her alive. If this was Quin-Rong, whatever happened between 9:20 in the morning when she was first seen with this man and 3:30 in the afternoon when she was last seen remains a mystery. As soon as they learned of this, composite sketches of this possible suspect were posted all over the Lower East Side and on the entrance of PS2. The night of May 29, 1997, police continued to canvass the area and search the subway system, looking for any witnesses or signs of who this man might have been. But they turned up with nothing. No more witnesses, no surveillance, nothing. They stated they were considering all suspects, including the possibility that this was someone who knew Quin-Rong and her family, or even the Chinatown rapist, someone who had been terrorizing the area for years, mostly young girls held at knife point in the same area as Quin-Rong. They tried their best to study a surveillance video that was placed outside of the New York Post printing factory on South Street, since it wasn't far from where she was found, but that also turned up with nothing. As police investigated, they would also learn that there was a man near PS2 said to be staring at kids as they entered. It's possible this was the same person who would ultimately end up abducting Quin-Rong. Was this young girl taken somewhere and abused before being taken to another unknown location where she was slain? Were there other people involved? With all of the people going to and from work that busy morning, there were almost certainly more witnesses. Did they just choose to not come forward? Did anyone else remember seeing this little girl crying while with a stranger? These are some of the questions that came into the minds of authorities, and unfortunately, the grim theories didn't stop there. According to reports, Quin-Rong's own family came under suspicion when it was learned that the Wu family had another infant daughter who died back in China. This was learned throughout the investigation, and when they were asked about what happened, the parents gave two different stories about how she died. Quin-Rong's mother stated that the baby was placed into a river back in China, while her father stated that the child was born sick and left in front of a hospital. The two accounts contradicted each other, so authorities attempted to get more information about that child's death by contacting authorities in China, but it's unclear if they ever received any definitive answers on what took place. It's also important to note that due to China's one-child policy, abandoning children was more common than anyone would like, with families often feeling like they had no choice but to abandon a part of themselves, something that may be very hard to understand for those of us who weren't raised there, but for many, this was their harsh reality. The documentary One Child Nation goes into great detail about those times and the huge effect it would have on many families. It's definitely something I feel everyone should watch. By all accounts, Quin-Rong was very much loved by her family, and there was no reason to believe they'd done anything to harm her. Between the little information they'd managed to gather, what the eyewitness stated, and people seeing someone watching kids outside of the school, it seems that Quin-Rong was being watched, and when she wasn't in the presence of anyone, this person slipped in and took advantage of the opportunity. This could have easily been any other child. So many other children have gone missing just like this. How do we know they hadn't done it before? What if they did it again? What if it went under the radar, just like many other times before? Just more questions that we may never have the answers to. There were also claims that Quin-Rong might have worked at the same garment factory as her mother, even though she was just a child. In an interview, the son of the owner to that factory would deny those claims, saying there was a very strict policy that didn't allow children into the factory. But other workers stated that Quin-Rong was often seen at the factory, after school and on weekends, doing her homework and sewing labels. Her mother stated she did spend time there with her, but she didn't sew anything and she wasn't paid for any work. Different parties familiar with the situation told different stories. Whether it was true or not was never confirmed. In interviews with journalists, Quin-Rong's father had the following to say: "I never imagined that something like this would happen. Before we came here, we had dreams and good feelings about the United States, but now we feel differently. If we had known this were going to happen, we would not have come." On Tuesday, June 3rd of 1997, a service was held for Quin-Rong Wu at the Hong Kong funeral home in Chinatown. Dozens of people came and went, paying their respects, expressing their sadness and their anger. Everyone from strangers to staff at her school to her classmates. Her family sat in tears, distraught for most of the service, in a row just a few feet away, as Quin-Rong's small body lay in a coffin made of copper. Her coffin was surrounded by wreaths and many flowers, including a mix of white and pink carnations. Incense burned throughout the funeral home, and her altar had other offerings such as oranges, apples, and a ship made of paper left by the grief-stricken children at PS2. A white banner had 4 big Chinese characters written on it that translated to "wronged death to be vindicated." Following Chinese tradition, which can vary for different families throughout China, her young brother would burn stacks of fake money in an urn, normally done to symbolize payment of expenses that she would need for her passage after death. 3 monks surrounded her casket while chanting, as many left more gifts and stood before the altar reciting prayers to ensure that Quin-Rong's soul had a safe journey to the afterlife. Her mother couldn't stop from crying and spent most of the service asking herself, why? Her wails of sorrow were heard by anyone who attended. She asked why this happened, why her daughter had to meet such a terrible fate, why her young life has such a cruel and abrupt end. Her parents were surrounded by politicians, workers from the neighborhood, and friends, all saying what they could to try and make this time a bit easier. But it was nearly impossible to think positive at a time like this. Many donations were gathered for the family, totaling thousands of dollars. Donations came from all 5 boroughs, and even as far as California and Texas. All people who had heard about this tragedy on the news and read it in the papers. Her parents were grateful for the support that they had received. The generous donations made it clear that many people cared, and even if her story wasn't known around the world, it meant the world to the community. Everyone wanted justice, and they truly felt this family's pain, even if it couldn't compare to the hole it left in the hearts of her family. Before and after the service, while her coffin was still open, Quin-Rong's father spoke to her, saying to her, "If there really is a life after death, please tell the police what happened. This way you and your family can have peace." When the service was over, her parents were taken back to their home, since their beliefs at the time didn't allow them to bury their daughter. The funeral would then be headed by the youngest child in the family, her brother, who held a 2-foot stick of incense as his sister's coffin was carried out, the incense symbolizing Quin-Rong's life. Their older sister was by his side, as many took their last glances at the young girl as she was carried into a hearse. They would enter the vehicle to prepare for a procession, one that drove around the Lower East Side, the same neighborhood that the shy and curious 11-year-old once called home and grew to love. Their first stop was PS2, where she attended, followed by her apartment building on Henry Street, and the area where her body was recovered near the East River. Each time that they stopped, the driver made sure to open the back of the hearse to allow Quin-Rong's wandering spirit to find her body and enter. They lit more incense, said their final words, and prepared for the last drive to Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, where she would be laid to rest. While services were held, police didn't stop their search, going up and down Canal Street, dropping off posters and laminated cards with Quin-Rong's class photo on it, letting everyone know that if they saw anything, knew anything, they needed to come forward. Their attempt to get answers would turn up with nothing, as more and more time went by, and less information came their way. Several articles would be published in the years after Quin-Rong's slaying, hoping to jog someone's memory. Frequent trips were made back to PS2. The cold case detectives handed out flyers so that students and staff wouldn't forget that this was still very much an open investigation. Quin-Rong might have been gone for years, but her face was still all over the Lower East Side on posters, a constant reminder that their work here wasn't finished. For years, it felt like the veil of mystery surrounding her passing had only become heavier because there still were so many questions with absolutely no answers. By 2001, Quin-Rong's family had moved out of their 1-bedroom apartment on Henry Street. Her younger brother would continue to attend PS2 for some years after. When reached for an interview, her father would tell reporters that he was thankful for their concern, but it was just something he couldn't bear to speak about. In 2005, Police Sergeant Joe Gallagher would tell reporters that the case was still open, urging anyone with any information to dial New York City's tip line. Parents and staff at PS2 never forgot of what took place in 1997, speaking amongst themselves of the horrors that this child faced, pushing those feelings aside, waiting for their children to walk through those doors and into their arms safely. There's nothing to remember Quin-Rong and her story other than the posters passed out over the last 27 years. If you're watching this video and made it this far, please take a moment and make sure her story is well known, so that maybe this family can receive the closure and the justice that they and their daughter deserve. Today, there's very little mention of her and what took place back then. But with the way old cases are being solved these days, there is still hope. Just take a look at the case of 5-year-old Anne Sang Pham in 1982 out in California. In that case, it was a Vietnamese child who was abducted, violated, and slain by manual strangulation while on her way to school, the same exact way Quin-Rong's life was taken. She was found dead 2 days later. It would take 40 years for authorities to make an arrest, but in 2022, her and her family finally received justice and closure. The person who did this, 70-year-old Robert John Lanu, a former U.S. soldier and registered sex offender in the state of Nevada. He was captured by a single strand of hair found at the scene, and all thanks to detectives who never let go and vowed to solve her case. Now more than ever, it's most definitely possible. So if you ever find yourself near Henry Street in the Lower East Side, or maybe walking by the banks of the East River, or even passing through Grand Street or West 4th on your commute, take a moment to remember 11-year-old Quin-Rong Wu, the happy, shy child who lost her life. The child who made the long journey with her family from China to the United States in hopes of better opportunities, but instead had her life taken at the hands of a monster who might still be among us, leaving her to make one final journey into the afterlife. As of this year, 2024, the case remains unsolved. She would have been 38 years old. Rest in peace to Quin-Rong Wu, and my deepest condolences go out to her family and loved ones. You aren't forgotten.